So to say a few words about Deb, uh, Dr. Deb Morrison is a learning scientist. She's also a science STEM educator among many of the roles that she undertakes. Her research and practice focuses on equity in both science and science education. I first met her when I was in grad school, and we both were Jumki Basu scholars at conference NARST. I believe it was Pittsburgh. And she talked about teacher professional development, equity-focused practices specific to climate science education. She's also the one who introduced me to CLEAN in that conversation, and after that, I followed it through. So the ClimeTime initiative that she talks about today is also something that I have frequently followed, looked up. What are people doing in Washington? How can we think about some of those things in Nebraska? So I'm very excited to hear about this today and excited to welcome you.
Thank you. Thank you. Can I get a thumbs up if I can be heard okay? Okay, that's great. Thanks so much. I have been having audio challenges on my technology. I would also like to take a moment and just introduce Elizabeth Schmitz. So Elizabeth, if you can unmute yourself and tell the world who you are here.
Good morning. My name is Elizabeth Schmitz. I'm the Environmental and Sustainability Education Program Supervisor at OSPI. So one of the staff people who's been helping support the ClimeTime project since the beginning of 2019. Really happy to be here and hear about the portrait work that Deb's been focused on lately.
And so jump in at any point, Elizabeth, if you want to add or embellish things. It's super helpful.
Thanks, Deb.
All right, so we're going to talk about ClimeTime today. And before we do, there's a number of different people and places that we have to acknowledge in this work. So we're going to talk about it from the frame of climate justice, which is how the initiative has been implemented, and thinking about how we're centering equity inside all the dimensions of science education in this space. So we'll unpack that a little bit more. We'd like to acknowledge our tribal space that we operate in, that within the boundaries of Washington State, there's numerous tribal communities that have lived there since time immemorial. And so understanding that and acknowledging that is something that we try to build into the work we're doing with teachers, with our leaders across the state. And it's something we encourage everyone to do. There's a website there to dig into your own location anywhere in the world and think about who are the tribal communities that have lived in your location since time immemorial and how are you partnering and working with them. This work is a huge collaboration, and I say that with a little bit of a giggle. I'm sure Elizabeth is like, right? so it is, I'd like to sort of name the leadership team in this space, and there's others that are taking leadership roles in a variety of ways, but Dr. Ellen Ebert, who's the Director of Teaching and Learning, Science and Environmental Sustainability Education at the Office for the Superintendent for Public Instruction, and wow, it took me almost 2 years to be able to say that. And Elizabeth, who's here with us, myself, Dr. Phil Bell, who I work with at the Institute of Science and Math Education, as well as many others like Cheryl Leiden, who's worked across the Educational Service District as coordinating work, and just a plethora of people. So do check out the website that we have as a communication tool to sort of dig into all the different partnerships we have. I'm going to give a little bit of an overview and then dig into some details of what this looks like in action in different locations to kind of really think about what we're doing. So one of the things to understand about this work is that Washington State has taken a systems level approach to climate education, which apparently, the more and more I investigate at national and international levels, is quite novel. And so the work that was done to instigate this is not my work. I'm speaking for the project and for the many partners, and I really need to name that. So there was an incredible effort in Washington State to get this proviso in place, the funding proviso that has initiated. We're 2 years into the actual implementation. But there was, wow, at least a year, probably a decade worth of effort locally for folks in the, largely in the informal education community, the community-based partners, to really move and organize a proviso. And there's a great article on the ClimeTime website that really details that process if you look under news. It's the Catalyst article in Green Schools, so please go ahead and have a look at that. It details the sort of process to get this proviso in place. So the proviso was a legislative proviso initiated by the governor in 2017-18. It provided $4 million of funding in the 2018-19 year. That was a one-year proviso. In 2019 onward, we had an additional proviso that was put in place that unrolled funding in a different line item for continuation funding. And that gave us $3 million for 2019-20 and another $3 million for 2021. So we are literally just transitioning between year 2 and 3 right now, because the transfer date is June 30th, July 1st. So we're moving into the second year or the third year of continuous funding. I like this picture because this is Ellen here. Can you see my arrow? Yeah, you can. So this is Ellen here, and this is our governor, Jay Inslee. So Ellen's right at the table from the first, shepherding this effort forward. So this is what the proviso sounds like. So I'll give you a minute to sort of have a look at that. And so a couple key things about this. One, we took an approach where it wasn't just education structures that currently exist in the quote unquote formal system, which I'm going to refer to as the school-based system. It was also community-based organization educational efforts, which many people refer to as the informal education system, and I'm going to call the community education system. And so it's the way in which we are working across and between and integrating school and community-based educational efforts. And I would argue as we go forward, we're also starting to name other areas. So career and technical education, other kinds of components, higher education that need to be more deeply interwoven into such an initiative. But this initiative started with school and community-based educational efforts and trying to interweave them. And it centered the learning around next generation science standards. So while many folks may think of Washington State and other areas of the country as very sort of green leaning, and we definitely have that with many of the governor's initiatives and efforts, the state is actually very much a patchwork. So in different areas in the state, we have more conservative or more left-leaning sort of pockets. And so this effort is really a statewide initiative that's really meant to reach people in agricultural areas, in rural communities, in urban contexts. And as a result, the focus wasn't strictly on climate science. It was actually a wedge approach to use the next generation science standards, including climate science education. You'll note that with the branding of the initiative, we actually centered climate science, right? ClimeTime. But the initiative actually had hooks for different educational service districts or school districts to hook into the initiative with science standards more generally as well. I would say though, now every educational service district is doing some aspect of climate science learning, though not everyone is doing it as deeply as every other district. So the funding objectives were to work with educational service districts, which are a network of large regional hubs across the state. I want to say 9. Is that correct? 9 off the, yeah. And then community-based organizations, some which were statewide and some which were more regional kind of hubs. Those are the direct funded community-based organizations. So 3 million of the original proviso went to educational service district and 1 million went directly to community-based organizations. However, because of the need and the explicit desire to have them collaborate, there are a number of other smaller community-based organizations that also got funding through educational service districts. And some of the community-based organizations were statewide too, I think, in particular, were very statewide efforts, had, hooks already into different places. And all projects had to produce open educational resources as an equity design measure. We don't want things that are proprietorial being funded with public money. And all efforts were collaborative, coordinated, and trying not to be duplicating each other. So innovations were kind of seeded into different spaces, and there was a lot of coordination among them so that we could actually foster those innovations in future years into other areas, but not start with the same innovation in the same place, so that we could actually get a lot of ideas generating in the initiative. There were priority audiences. This was an equity justice focused initiative. So there's different foci on things like tribal nations, migrant students, students in poverty, rural and remote schools, and students with different sort of aspects of oppression that they've experienced. So, and that's been taken up in a number of different ways. Different groups focused on different priority audiences, and we'll talk a little bit about how that's unfolded over the couple of years. So this is our sort of like mishmash of the complex system in which we work, all right? So students are at the center of the work we're doing, and the way that we're doing that is through their teachers. Like the proviso centered on professional learning. So we're trying to think of how do we support and really resource teachers in the most effective way to serve the students they serve, not students generically, their students. And then how do we do that through collaborations with community-based organizations, universities, business, maybe local governments? How do we work as OSPI, as the Association of Educational Service Districts Network, as these sort of formal structures of education to really pull together and support teachers? Washington State is also very interesting that it has a fairly well functioning and existing network of called the Washington Science Fellows, which is a network. I don't know exactly what year it's in, Elizabeth, but I feel like it's in like a decade kind of level existence that is supported by the ESDs and is broadly supported by all the districts that fund it, and provides opportunity for teachers to do a 3-year fellowship inside the Science Fellows program to gain leadership skills. So we have this incredible plethora of science education leaders situated in schools and districts. And the other thing I should note, we have a little bit of an unfair advantage nationally because we also have the Mark Winchell and Jessica Thompson and Melissa Brayton's work that is through the University of Washington in the Ambitious Science Teaching Project is housed in Washington State. So much of the work that actually led into some of the base things in NGSS, that research was done in Washington State. And so we have decades worth of teachers who have been through programs with those people. So lots of really good practice-based teaching going on. The partners these are the people that were actually funded. So there was like a grant program through the proviso that went out to the educational service districts and then went out to these community-based organizations. And that's kind of how the money moved from place to place. We also had critical partners, so folks like the UW Climate Impacts Group. Dr. Heidi Roop has been all over the state doing different things in different partnerships. Frank here on the call has come into the state, and Climate Generation has come into the state with webinars. And then ourselves at the Institute of Science and Math Education have been partners in like the design and implementation of the professional learning effort, as well as doing some case study work and development of STEM teaching tools. And what else have we done, Elizabeth? We've done some work around assessment. I've helped support the assessment working group and some work around practical measures. So understanding how implementation's folding out and how we're understanding that to modify the implementation and the design of what's needed. So from a research perspective, this is what I would name as a design-based implementation research project. So we have a shared goal. We're trying to figure out how to implement and learn from it as we go. Remind me later and I can throw the reference for DBIR in there. Any questions at this point? Because we're going to switch over to a little bit more of the how to. Any questions on the proviso? Frank?
Deb, thank you, and Elizabeth as well. And you know this is a standing question. I ask it often about this work. But the career and technical education part, while it was parallel, right? It was $1 million. Was it once? Was it multiple years? And do you see? You alluded to it, but I just want to be more explicit. Do you see that as carrying on in this ClimeTime space, or is it really its own thing? Because you alluded to other types of education need to be broadened and brought into this space, but is specifically because there's already been funds about the career and technical education piece. Just could you speak a little bit more about that?
Yeah, for sure. So career and technical education wasn't explicitly funded in the ClimeTime proviso, but at the same time the ClimeTime proviso was funded, the state also funded a significant effort in career and technical education. And so because of Ellen's position in OSPI and her relationships in the state, the other advantage Washington State has is that we're kind of the end of the road in some ways. People come here and they love it so much they never leave. And so as a result, we have a lot of stability in our various offices in certain ways. So Ellen is like an institution unto herself in her connections and networks in the state. And because of that, she had connections with Dan Tidor, who is in CTE. And so Dan Tidor attended all of the ClimeTime network meetings for the first year and really thought across those boundaries. And then Ellen and I participated in designing and building a framework for climate change education in the CTE because of those networks. And so we kind of bridged the two efforts, but didn't totally interweave them. Though I think that going forward, that is something that I would encourage people to bring CT into the fold as they build provisos, because there's an incredible amount of potential there, and that's something we're still continuing to explore. We're moving into more high school work this coming year, so we'll start to see that unfold a lot more in the next year, I think. And with a grant that we're writing with tribal partners, we're thinking about that from an I-test perspective, so career trajectory development and how we actually integrate that deeply. And that grant that we're working on with tribal partners is actually unfolding as part of the proviso this next year too, because there's some funding that the ESDs have allocated to foster that type of climate justice career technical effort this year. Elizabeth, did you want to throw something into that?
Yeah, I'll just add that with Dan's assistance, we have begun drafting a climate science equivalency framework that will be offered through career and technical ed. So that's exciting.
And those
Awesome.
type of overlaps are critical, I think, because different lobbying efforts in states sort of lean toward particular understandings of education and learning, and we need to be leveraging climate change across all of them. So coordinating those efforts at some level is really important, I think. Yeah.
But just to build on this point a little bit, Deb and Elizabeth, is that given the economic devastation that's coming from our COVID, and it looks like it's just we're going to go back into even deeper dive into this. Keeping that connection between rebuilding the economy and addressing climate change, those have to be really carefully thought through, and the career and technical part of climate change education is really powerful part of that strategy. So, I think you get it, but I just wanted to name it.
Absolutely. I think, and I've been trying to name this in every place possible in the last few months, that if we're thinking about climate change, if we're thinking about COVID recovery, we have got to be thinking about educational spaces in career technical education, how that fits forward into STEM education more generally and broadly, from not only the perspective of climate change, but of building green economies, how that, and I know many people on this call understand those connections, but not everyone in government understands the connections between things like climate and energy education or career development around those spaces, about green building technologies and how we can think about career and technical education around green building that is actually about climate change too, and how climate change education needs to be integrated into that green building. So it's not just what to do, but why I should be doing it. And that deeper learning component should be there. All right, so let's jump into the framing. So as the initiative got implemented, we framed it under the framework for K-12 science education, which really talks about interests and identity. And that's how we sort of framed the justice, the equity and justice components of climate learning. That we really have to understand who our students are, who our communities are, and how we connect to the justice components, and then how we're designing learning so that we're connecting into equitable opportunities for every student to both learn climate change and pursue careers in STEM related to climate change efforts. We kind of frame them inside these design principles, for a better way of saying it. And the one that on here that I think is often most confusing for folks, many of these are pretty straightforward. System coherence is about how all of the different components that we've been talking about speak to each other, understand each other, trust each other, know each other. So, and a huge part of our effort in the state is actually just building those cooperations. In the first year was actually even just between the ESDs, our educational service districts, and our community-based organizations. Like the amount that we actually built trust and relationships between them was quite remarkable after even a year of just like 3 meetings that we sat down together and started understanding what our challenges were, how we were facing them, how we could support each other in them. Where our strengths were that we could leverage across the system. So that's about system coherence. It's not a given that people from the scientific community, people from the nonprofit community, people from the educational district community, that they're going to even understand each other. Like when I say the word equity or when I say the word science, or those things are actually cultural artifacts, and we need to unpack them in practice and understand like, well, what would the kids be doing and what would I understand in this space? Okay, working at home is humorous. I had a spider join me. Okay, sorry. So, and then from the perspective of infrastructuring, that's about given these differences, given these assets and resources we have in the system, how do we support people who have a challenge in another area and a need? How do we identify that need and how do we support it? Not necessarily from the top down, but sometimes peer to peer. How do we bridge that and support it? And sometimes that can be also about like a physical need, like we're lacking a curriculum or we're lacking a thing like a STEM teaching tool or some kind of physical resource that we need to be able to provide. And then equitable classroom pedagogy, I think we'll see that as we kind of unpack the different things. The last one is multiple ways of learning. We do not state anywhere in our initiative that there's one method of learning. We actually really complicate that and say learning occurs in multiple contexts across multiple communities and places, that it's tied to place and land, that it's in relation to each other, and that because of all of those different aspects of learning, we need a lot of different people involved. And that learning occurs both for children, for adults, between adults, for elders, from elders. And so that we have a very sort of quilt version of multiple ways of learning. That there are a lot of different ways we learn, and I individually learn in many different ways. And so do we as individuals across space, which makes it complicated to design learning environments, but super fun and always something we learn from. So in practice, the website has a number of different examples that are starting to unfold. And I think the best, in some ways, examples that you're going to start to see are, we are adding a place to our website space. And I think it will be under this sort of success stories, or beside it is the decision that's coming out. We're literally in the week of making that decision. So, but it will be portraits of projects. And we've been working on this effort this spring to really give more detailed storytelling of what's happening in any one location or one sort of piece of a project. And unfolding it, like what happened, what were the teachers saying, if we have student voice or examples, what did that look like, so that people can understand what is the work at the grassroots level to be able to think about how to explain this to legislators, how to explain this to other people who may not be in the weeds of the work. So that's kind of what we were trying to do. We're building towards next year's effort to see if we actually will have a fourth year or more, and to try and explain to people what this complex fabric of a ClimeTime effort is. So let's give a couple examples for you. So professional learning. This is early learning in ClimeTime, where 6 P2 teachers are working together and thinking, so they're actually, it's not 6 P2 teachers. It's like preschool to 2nd grade teachers are working together and thinking about what does learning look like in that context? Because climate science learning in the early elementary environment is actually not climate change per se. It's the basic building blocks that will lead into learning further up the sort of developmental scale. And so in this context, we're actually having teachers go through, we're doing a professional learning strategy of engaging in learning and then decomposing learning. So you do the tasks that students would do, and then you think about like what was good or bad about that, like how would I do that with my students, what would be challenging about that, how would I adapt it to my own context. And so really getting at understanding these complex topics by engaging in inquiry-based learning at this level. And so really having teachers with science fellows, so these educational leaders in their space, involved in that type of practice. And really, like, especially in the elementary level, it's important to have scientists and experts in the content in that space, because there's a lot of questions in that moment that teachers need to just feel comfortable and vulnerable in voicing and in being resourced for. Is that Mark Winchell?
Yes, it is, Deb. Hello.
Hi, I totally gave a call out to you earlier on the Ambitious Science Teaching Project.
Oh, good. Well, I just wanted to see what you were doing today. Thanks for the invitation.
Yeah, well, welcome. Yeah. So you probably can answer some of these questions if we have them for you as we go on. That's great. All right, so then there's another effort around young teachers, sort of elementary teachers, was in Yakima. And this one is, again, you can see engaging teachers. In this case, there's actually kits of resources that would be provided to teachers. So sometimes the resources are literally physical resources to help teachers who may not have those types of things in their district, to provide them experience in going through and material management, thinking about how to engage students in inquiry-driven instruction, and ask questions. So many of these efforts are actually multiple contact points, or a couple days in a row of intense work together, where the teachers can then go back to their districts and train local folks. And so this works as a really good model for rural districts that they don't necessarily have the resources to send a lot of people far away to a training, but could do a training for one person if they can come back and help with training in more local contexts. This one here is thinking about, this is part of the science seminars. I think that's Heidi at the board there. And so this is thinking about the way in which teachers actually engage in very topical phenomena-based learning. So learning for teachers to deepen their own confidence and knowledge about climate science. So this one wasn't so much geared at curricula that teachers could take back into the classroom. It was more geared at improving teachers' own climate science understanding. Given that there's only about 5% of teachers in the workforce that have an earth science systems background, this is a really important move to ensure that teachers feel confident in engaging in climate science education. And so this was topical and it was regionally done. So this one, I think the example is around fire. And that type of example was done in more the plateau region of Washington State, where fire is more prevalent. There was one done out on the coast around sea level rise, and there was other topics that were engaged in that were more regionally defined topics, so that teachers in the region could come into that learning environment, engage with data, with real examples, with experts from the field in that particular content area, and ask all their 10,000 questions. And then many of those teachers would then have some time at the end of the day to think about, how would I integrate that into my own courses? So it wasn't actually like all the biology teachers in one area, it was all the teachers who were interested in that topic in one area coming in, and then thinking about how they might weave that phenomenon into their own learning. And so this is another example, thinking about how the fire example more deeply. So actually running them through different climate change language too. So the idea of prevention or adaptation, maybe mitigation, having them think about solutions-centered instructions. So we don't just define problems endlessly for students and for teachers, because we don't want to leave them as learners in that space either. But thinking about how to work through the process of inquiry into a phenomena and through into action steps. How does that work as we're kind of building knowledge and understanding? This is an example. The next one is the one that was the learning in places around, not learning in places, sorry. That's a very different initiative, but the science STEM seminars as well. But this was done with sea level rise. This was one of the ones that was focused on sea level rise. And so one of the key aspects of all this professional learning is that teachers are engaged in the scientific practices that they will engage students in. So they are not just listening to sort of transmission type instruction on climate change. They're looking at data. They are engaged in activities to try and understand some kind of mechanism. They're engaged outside, out of doors, with observations around different phenomena.
Deb, if I could jump in.
Yeah.
I'd just like to add that one of the really powerful ways that the STEM seminars helped teachers engage in learning about climate science and climate change education was that regional approach that really focused on helping teachers see, how is the climate changing where I am? Because the climate is really actually very different, and the impacts are very different from coastal Washington to the plateau region. And many teachers who struggle with fear around parental or administrative reactions to the teaching about climate change, when they were able to see the data and think about how this is real for where I am in my place, it really helps alleviate a lot of those concerns and help them feel more grounded in how to address this with their students and families.
Absolutely. So we also had a lot of partners in terms of what we're talking about with those connections between community-based organizations, but in this case, it's also about local businesses. So thinking about oyster farmers and how their industry might be impacted by sea level rise or ocean acidification, and working with those partners to actually understand that no matter where you're going in your career trajectory, you are likely being impacted in some way by climate change. And so learning about climate change is a universal at this moment that we really need to think about in how we weave it into all different areas of classroom-based or community-based learning. One of the ways that we're trying to understand both what interests and identity challenges and learning opportunities are being faced by students and by teachers is this idea of assessment. And we're doing it in sort of some traditional assessment ways, formative assessment and summative assessment methods that you might see over on this side. and customizing and providing some examples, some educative examples that can be used across the state. But we're also doing it in this other way around sensing. As we're implementing, we're trying to sense. So, and that field of work in research literature is named as practical measures. Kara Jackson's done a bunch of work in that mathematics, and we're doing more work in science around that. And Bill Penwell, William Penwell at CU Boulder has been doing a lot of work in that. So really thinking about, like, did this work feel authentic? So how are learners experiencing learning, not just what they're learning? And trying to understand, like, how we're improving the learning environment. And that gets at that issue of equity and equitable opportunity for learning. Whoops, look at me, I'm going over to my, clicked on the link to my actual guide for sense making, sorry about that. And so for thinking about, let's see here, there we go. So all of this work so far is really thinking, and our assessment measures in particular, are thinking about how we're lifting diverse student voices and helping that inform the design of any local effort and then of the effort across the state. So the Governor's STEM Innovation Alliance actually highlighted ClimeTime at one point in the effort, and we were able to bring a number of the student groups who have been benefiting from this type of instruction into contact with the governor so that they could actually more directly speak and have their voice heard. So this is also something to think about in statewide initiatives, is how are we educating our decision makers and letting them really hear and see the voices of those that are being served by these types of efforts. We have a number of communication. Wow, the communication effort across the statewide initiative should not be underestimated. So, like, the ability to have structures and systems in place to be able to speak to people across the effort and hear across the effort. So this two-way communication method is really important. We have things like the website itself and the newsletter. We have an OER Commons page where we're posting out resources as they're becoming available. We also have 3 times a year, we have the actual initiative meetings where we come together as the network sort of leaders of the different projects and share across. So, you know, we listen as the university and as OSPI, we listen all year. And then at different times we're like, oh, this project should like talk to the group, or this project. And we help lift them in the design of the 3 meetings that happen every year to really learn from each other. We build things together. A lot of STEM teaching tools are getting built out of this initiative to think about things like, how do we address politics in the classroom in the teaching of climate science? How do we center solution-based learning? How do we deal with action learning? Is it activism? Is activism something we should have in the classroom? Those are all questions that have percolated up, and we think of as opportunities of practice that we're building resources around to help further, not just here locally, but more broadly across the US. We also are building many of these things into Access tools. So Access is a project that we also work on at the university that involves, now the Access 2 project is all 50 states plus the territories and the DoD. And so we're helping leverage some of the STEM teaching tools and other types of resources being built in ClimeTime into these national efforts of equity and climate science learning. Access is not just climate science learning, it's NGSS-centered learning. Again, we take that as a political lens because climate science learning is not going to be an accessible wedge in all places, even though we need it to be everywhere. There's ways to get in. There's an evaluation report, and I'll share these slides out. I think I sent them to Patrick, so they'll be posted somewhere. And there's hyperlinks in all of them to be able to get to the different reports. They're also available off the ClimeTime site. So in the first year of the initiative, we reached a striking number of educators, considering that it was up, we're building the plane and flying it the first year. And we should have the evaluation reports from the second year shortly of how many people we reached. But one of the things we had to adjust during COVID is we went virtual in our network meeting in March, and then in some of the other ways in which we helped provide professional learning and adjust for organizations. And so we'll have a portrait of a project that's specifically about how we adapted to the COVID situation that will be out shortly. And we reached a shocking number of teachers in 2 virtual conferences that we sort of impromptu did. Thanks very much to Elizabeth and all the OSPI staff. I can't remember what the number was, Elizabeth, but I want to say it's in the range of 2,000 teachers that we reached just in a few days contact. Yeah. And then there's a number of different sort of teachers' voice that we wanted to sort of name and lift here. Things that are about really helping teachers engage in authentic science practices with scientists, learning from and with scientists, helping scientists also actually learn more about what teachers need in their outreach efforts. Really thinking about some case studies of these ideas of what does it mean to have multiple ways of knowing and what kinds of iterations have been done. And explicitly inside the the case study report, we really named a lot of the collaboration and measurement practices as being helpful. So thinking about how different types of practical measures or assessment could help teachers really hear their students in ways that they hadn't really engaged in before. Thinking about taking students into the field to do science is doable. A lot of our community-based partners were able to show teachers through learning as teachers how to manage outdoor experiences for students, how to not be afraid to get kids outside, exploring and learning. And also this idea of I can learn with my students, that should not be underestimated. That's a common understanding we have when we work in science with elementary teachers, that they need more support about being able to learn as their students learn. But that was actually found to be true among all levels of teachers, that we really needed to provide opportunities for teachers to be able to learn as they go, because this is an area which is constantly growing and is intimidating for teachers. So some takeaways, this is the Learning in Places briefs that have just come out from Dr. Megan Bang and her team. And so really thinking around how we can collaborate across a lot of different communities, that's essential. No one of our teams is the expert, quote unquote. We all learn from each other in deep and important ways. And how from this we can actually think about working with historically marginalized communities in ways that are not us going out to save them, but us in many ways being saved by our collaborations with them, and thinking of the way that we can be respectful and consistent in those relationships and build trust. Thinking about how we need to build a lot more administrative support. So while teachers have named that they need the support, our administrators also need that support to be able to learn and grow with the teachers and be able to field a lot of the questions they're getting. And then really focusing on those relevant, authentic, local police-based topics. That seems to be just a solid message that is so beneficial for folks. Going forward, we're extending our partnerships with different tribal nations this coming year in our 3rd year. We have the educational service districts have worked it out, and Ellen was able also to name in the new proviso statement this year of how we can actually direct funding to tribal nations, because they weren't named in the proviso the first 2 years, so we couldn't actually put money directly to them. So that was challenging. But now that's available. Focusing on attention on high school this coming year we've sort of been moving up the K-12 spectrum each year as a focal point, even though some places are working across other areas, and continuing to refine the policy and program implementation. So like, what is it that we are doing in our networking efforts across the state that we need to sort of continue to resource and learn from each other? I think part of that is also the way that we're leaning outward. So we're because of the nature of this initiative being a state initiative, we're getting asked a lot to share our thinking with other states and with the international community, and there's a certain capacity issue there. So we're trying to think about that carefully and how we can can do that, but also we're learning a lot as other states are starting to dig into things. So we're interested to always know what other people are doing. And so Climate Ecos, I'm part of Climate Ecos, and I actually just had a call this morning with the UK and the climate outreach effort to try and understand how to inform that and sort of keep everybody working in that sort of justice lens inside the climate efforts that are going on internationally. So big shout out to all our partners, and this is a fraction of them. So, but like all of our partners, they would have a whole page likely at this point, and we're working on getting those logos. That's the challenge. But yeah, really big shout out to all the community-based organizations. I would say that if you go ahead with a climate change initiative in your state and you don't involve community-based organizations, I don't think you're going to have a fraction of the success that we're having locally. And you're not going to get the kind of amplification into the community that you want to see, because schools is like the 30-year project. It's the long-term effort. Youth definitely help educate their parents, but it's also the long-term career trajectory effort. We really need to be going much wider in our communities right now with climate change efforts. And by involving community-based organizations, we're able to reach a lot more people and sort of learn in all different directions. And that's what we really need to be doing right now. And I think I mentioned this earlier, that we have these existing networks. I think I'm going to leave it at that. So any questions? I know we have a few minutes before the end of the day. Barty, I don't know if you want to.
Yes, there are many questions. So Jim has 2 questions. Do you want me to read the questions, or do you want to find them in the chat? I can read them.
Maybe if Jim can voice them, that'd be good.
Yes. So Jim's first question is, are there ways climate education programs based primarily in other states connect with your marvelous and essential programs in Washington state? He further says to learn from you, to share resources and experiences, and then especially in the context of student teams and leading teachers to connect. So could you address that?
So I think in terms of there was a lot of questions and I just suddenly looked at them all too. So in terms of the resources, let's see. Connecting with Washington State, generally we're doing that through either myself or Ellen. So we're kind of funneling those requests in through either myself or Ellen, and her and I are in fairly constant communication to try and not duplicate efforts. In terms of learning from us, we will be posting, we're writing more now and trying to get sort of white paper versions of what we're doing out in real time so that people don't have to wait for research publications to come out. So our evaluation reports are helpful. Our case study reports are going to be helpful, and they're all available off of the presentation that I believe Patrick's posted. And so please feel free to dig into those. If you are involved in a state effort and you want to kind of think through how to do it, I think sending an email to both Ellen and myself is probably helpful, and one of us will tag in on that and have a conversation with you. I've already been in conversation like that with New York and California and New Jersey. And so Frank is also a good person to randomly talk to about climate change efforts. He's been inside all of these things too. So I think that's the best way to do it. The nitty-gritty details of how to do it depending from your position, it can be better to talk to one or the other of us. Like if you're a research-based partner, talk to me. If you're a state person, you might want to talk to Ellen. So because we have slightly different perspectives, but we can still give you the whole picture, either one of us. I'm sure Elizabeth can do that too. Elizabeth, I don't mean to speak for you. So I think that's helpful. We would really like people who are coming to us to have dug into the website and evaluation reports and things before they talk to us. So we're not repeating things that are already out there in the world, because it's a time efficiency and capacity challenge. So that would be helpful. And the portraits that we're putting up are really specifically intended to help support work in other places. So really digging into those as they come up. We'll have a social media campaign around them too. So we have a WA ClimeTime, so WA ClimeTime hashtag, not hashtag, at ClimeTime, that you can follow on Twitter, that will be doing a social media post around those as well. So I think that's most of that question.
The second question we have from Jim is about NGSS standards and alignment with these resources, elementary, middle, and high school.
Yeah, everything is aligned with NGSS. We're an NGSS adopted state. And so everything is clearly aligned with NGSS. We've had to do quite a bit of learning internally as a network with our CBOs, because of course CBOs don't necessarily know NGSS inside and out. So, but more and more partnerships are developing that cross-link ESDs and CBOs. And so all of the work is NGSS aligned, yes. And we have also been directing people at clean resources and the climate literacy framework. So people are sort of taking up different aspects of that as well.
So building on that, keep talking about that, answer Dawn's question. Are there structures in the program to bring climate change to ELA, math, social studies, and the arts?
Well, yeah, a couple projects related to that that are kind of overlapping the boundaries. So we have taken an approach where science is not objective and neutral, which may or may not be something all of you love, but we think of science as socially situated, and because of that there are natural overlaps with different discipline areas, and different teachers are taking that up in ways. Elementary for sure is doing that, like elementary is all over it. They always are better at it than any of us. The Climate Justice League project in ESD 112 actually took the Rethinking Schools work around the Curriculum for the Earth, I think it's called. And they have leveraged that effort, which was a social studies effort, to deepen the science component of it and connect it to NGSS. So amazing project. And there will be a portrait on them to dig in more deeply. And any of the portraits, if you like the work particularly on a portrait, the contact information for who authored that project will be on those portraits. So you can dig in more deeply on a specific tangent with people who were on the ground doing that work. Yeah, I know we're just about out of time here.
Couple more questions.
Sure.
Christy Buffington asks, how many hours are the STEM seminars, and when in the year do teachers attend them?
So each of the individual projects, I'm going to sort of defer that one to the portraits as they come out, because the details of the projects are all outlined. Like we literally have how many hours, who's involved, what the structure was of any given project. And since there were, 15 to 16 mega sort of project fundees in the state, and each of those places sometimes had like 4 or 5 projects. I don't know that I'm the best person to speak on the detail of all of the pieces, because I have the overview, but I don't necessarily have the deep. I do know for the STEM seminars that they were generally like one-day contact, and that but many people who did the STEM seminars came back to the next one or followed it into a different region and attended one in another region because they love them so much. And many of those folks have followed into other areas of the ClimeTime efforts. Yeah.
The last question from Tyler Katzmar. What types of tools do you provide teachers in the kits for climate ed? He also adds on to the question as a statement, physical tools are so helpful for rural communities and those teachers without much allowance from their school districts.
So yeah, and a thing about the kit issue. So there was a pushback against kit teaching because kits are proprietorial. And that's a real issue. We don't want to get into a situation where you have to use this kit because it's the way that things are defined. And that has happened a little bit in the first year, especially. So there's a discouraging of doing that. However, you can't completely do that from an elementary lens, because sometimes elementary, like showing how you might leverage a kit in professional development to extend climate science learning is a reality of the space that we're in right now, that we can't have everybody just starting everything from scratch. So some projects did provide locally made kits that they had around a specific curricular effort that they're doing. And I think maybe, and I know Elizabeth might know better than I, but I think maybe things like zombie guacamole that green schools might have done, that they would provide a kit related to that around food waste in cafeterias. But others used kits by things like the Smithsonian or others. So the OER resources around the professional learning are open access, but the kits, if you wanted to do the exact same thing with the same kit, then the kits would have been proprietorial. But you could use a different kind of kit and develop your own thing from it. So there's a little bit of a tension as we sort of leaned into the project, and this coming year, there's pushback much more firmly against that, like that we don't want things that are proprietary curriculum being used because it's harder for people to take up their resources in new places. Physical tools in terms, there is that issue that in elementary or rural spaces that are under-resourced, we do need to have physical resources sometimes. And so being able to provide that from a central space like an ESD is something that some of the ESDs just do because of the communities they work with.
That's all the questions I had, Deb.
That's great. Well, thank you so much for the chance to share this effort. It's really something that we're playing with internally and trying to understand how to build even better. So thanks so much. And just another shout out to all of the different collaborators across the state. I mean, it is a huge effort building on decades of work in the state by folks like Dr. Winshuttle here. And so, like, really thank you so much for allowing us to share.